Okay, hello everyone, and especially those that are not members of the AA. My name is Marko, and my pitch to Ursula, when I first asked her to come and talk for a conversation here at the AA, was partially to do with the legacy that the AA has in exploring and constructing architecture through film. I think that probably starts with Pascal Schoning's Diploma 3 unit, cinematic unit, a while ago, to more recent animated and narrative work done at the school. Ursula Mayer's work spans between different media, including film, video, sculpture, spatial installations. She was the 2014 recipient of the Derek Jarman Award for experimental film and the Otto Mauer Prize in 2007. Her work has been exhibited internationally, including a solo exhibition at Salzburg Kunstverein last November, and venues like Hayward Gallery, ICA, Whitechapel Gallery, Centre Pompidou, Palais de Tokyo, Kunsthalle Basel, and many, many other venues. Ursula's work is concerned with questions of identity, psychological and philosophical hybrids, I would say, and it often leads to some form of a space. Welcome, Ursula.
Thank you.
Should we maybe begin with one of your recent works, which is very much seen in a space, so it can sort of only be seen in a space, and that is cinesexual.
Yeah, we actually decided to show a short film, which is called Cinesexual. It's actually a film installation, it's a film sculpture, and the way I show it, it's like made as a preview that you see two images next to each other, but in the installation, actually it's on an extended screen is hanging in a room and it's projected on both sides. And I can talk a bit more about this piece after we watched it.
So these are two things that are being projected on two sides of a solid surface?
Yes.
So we have seen the film, and again, as we said, film is projected on two sides of a solid screen.
Yes, so basically the work relates to a work which was done by Michael Snow. He's an experimental filmmaker, so the work exists in the same structure already. So if anybody knows a bit about experimental filmmaking, he's a big icon. And what you see in the film he did is basically the way the film is actually made is also the way it's seen. So instead of the extended screen you see in the space, you have the plastic sheet which gets cut through. So there are two cameras on both sides. There's the performance happening, and then it's also like projected in the same way, just on a solid screen on both sides. So you basically film an event from both sides, but when you see the film sculpture, you will never have a chance to see the image at the same time. So of course it talks immediately about illusion of a space, the illusion how cinema creates space, and because we also called the talk today constructing identity, it's also about identity in the sense that in the original piece there is Michael Snow, the filmmaker, sitting, and he has two camera people, and a young woman is basically walking through, cutting the wall, cutting the plastic wall, and then is going back. In my case, I have actually two performers, and these two performers are performers I'm working quite a lot. The one is like Valentine de Hing. She's a transgender model from the Netherlands. She also studies literature, she also is a DJ, so I collaborated with her quite a lot now for 3 projects, and I'm also just now preparing a feature film with her. And the second performer in this piece is J.D. Samson. She's maybe someone knows from you, Le Tigre, or Man. It's like a riot girl band from New York, so she's quite a big queer icon. So I decided to basically work with people, or with now friends and performers who, first of all, stand in with their own personality, with their own kind of projection of the idea of their body and also the idea of their gender. And so I kind of reversed a piece of Michael Snow. So to go back to a piece which has already history, which has already been inscribed as a specific work, I kind of revisited it, and with performers I'm working.
And then this is something that you do quite a lot in your work. You refer to either art or films or ideas that have already been produced, but you kind of critique them. Would you say it's a critique of those ideas? Or is it kind of contemporary way of trying to understand them?
I wouldn't say critique. It's basically a revisiting and sometimes a bit of a rewriting, and sometimes of a. I did a lot of works which I visited very specific architectural locations, and we visited them maybe with the idea of with a feminist interest of who lived there, who had impact on this building or something.
Yeah.
Maybe show a couple of more of these installations so people can see.
Yeah, so that's
the audience can see that. Yeah.
That's the installation.
And even then, I mean, this is an installation in a museum in Austria, and I played. There's 2 other films with JD and Valentine in the same space. So it was actually a piece I used as a linking point as well.
Between the 2 pieces.
Yes, between the 2 films which we will talk in a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so we now sort of go back in time to your sort of early work, which is probably something that architectural audience would have probably known you for, or would have come across this work as a very kind of explorative work of the kind of architecture. And so we are talking about interiors here. Mm-hmm. So that's the film set in Goldfinger Hand.
Yeah, so between 2006 and 2010, I made a couple of works in very specific architectural locations, a lot of time modernist locations. In a way, I was interested how architecture is already a fictional character and how fiction is inscribed in architecture. And of course, when I said we visited in this case the house of Erno Goldfinger, which maybe quite a lot of people know. And it was a meeting point in the 60s, 70s for artists. So there's a lot of works in there, like there's Max Ernst, there's Duchamp, and it's also now a museum. So you can visit this house. And my idea was to remake a work, because I was reading up which people would meet there, and there was also like mentioned that Barbara Hepworth was there, but there was no work of Barbara Hepworth in the collection. So I decided to remake a sculpture of her, which is a sculpture which actually turns and is a very typical Hepworth sculpture with these strings. So I made this work and placed it in the house, and then I invited two women, an older and a younger one, and they actually never meet. They just meet through this work, through this sculpture. And so kind of also it's a similar idea to kind of, revisit a place, think through how architecture has already a story in it, or how is it already made, and how can you look at it?
So, architecture being a character.
Yes. So.
And again, this is one of
a body of work I made.
Body of work,
yes.
About architecture.
Yes, I was also quite interested in a filmmaker, Michelangelo Antonioni, who uses almost no dialogue, and he frames architecture in a quite specific way, and I'm sure a lot of people know his work. Mm-hmm. The way he sets character in his films, the way he actually tells the whole film through different locations. It doesn't always have to be architecture, it can be just an empty space, you know. So through space, the inner, the kind of character he wants to develop for a performer or for a story in the film is mirrored in spaces, and that's how Antonioni works. And he also is famous for something which is called dead time. It's also a very specific way of editing, which means that he would go on with the camera also, especially a lot of times in locations where you usually would already cut if you would keep an suspension, you know, in a film. But the way he was very slow, and his characters are also developer of time, the way they move through space, the way he, you know, the way he fictionalizes the work. So I experimented with a couple of locations in this way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, how important is the architecture itself in this exercise? I mean, is architecture almost something secondary that you sort of try to find a narrative in, or is it?
No, it's not secondary, though, because the space gives the space actually. I'm not giving the story to a space. The space gives me ideas, or it gives me a certain history which I can look into, I can research. For example, these are Max Ernst objects. Like I said, I also remade them, but just because I was not allowed to touch them, because it was art, But, I kind of just played around. Basically, I put in this other sculpture by Barbara Hepworth. And, of course, I'm also interested in kind of re-looking at certain histories in terms of a feminist viewpoint. Or a lot of times we could also say history is written in a certain way, and, we can actually rewrite it. Or everybody can look at it again and kind of make its own interpretation. And as, I guess especially with modernism, there is a lot of potentialities which haven't been totally explored. So has been a lot of artists who actually have taken the chance to go back to historical important buildings and use them and work with them.
But do you think has it emerged at any point in your work that architecture was itself built maybe against certain principles of, let's say, related to gender or?
I mean, the Goldfinger house was a house which was very, how do you say, a lot discussed because a lot of people hated it. It was ugly, and there's a nice anecdote because Goldfinger in the James Bond film, so Goldfinger as an architect was actually viewed apparently as a monstrous person because of this brutalist, whatever, modernist, clear architecture. And there's this Goldfinger name for a James Bond film, and they use this name as a character. It even comes into mainstream cinema. I just worked with it in a different way. I think, in terms of space or places, or especially if you work with film and with narrative, space is always a part of it. Where we dwell, where we live, where we hoard our things, where we leave traces. Because
often the structure of space can sometimes communicate the certain social views on, let's say, women or children. I mean, things that, for example, Foucault writes, how our big dormitories are laid out to sort of exercise control over children and things like that.
Yeah.
I was just wondering whether any of that has sort of sparked.
I mean, I assume, the interior space was always like very much described as a female space, and the exterior very male, which I would try to not confirm to, because I don't really want that descriptions, or my whole work actually, not just this, but especially also the other work is kind of trying to liquefy ideas of binary systems, of where does something belong to, or how do we subscribe certain characters or genders to certain places.
And so maybe later on in work, I mean, this is called interiors, but maybe later on, exterior and interior do have a kind of interaction and a separate kind of importance. I mean,
of course, it is shown, the interior space is shown, but I think the way I try to capture or kind of, I assume the way, if you talk about interiors and the female description of the idea of the interior space, it is more about this bringing in something which was missing. In this case, it's Hepworth. Of course, I portrayed an interior space, but I also portrayed something what is not there, what I would have wished
to be
should be there.
And so this is more of the work that is.
That's even an earlier work you're showing now.
That is also related to architecture. So
this is a trilogy. This is actually still on video, because after that, all this work you see is shot on 16. This was a work I did actually when I arrived in London, and I started at Goldsmiths. I made 3 very short films, which this is the Keeling House in East London, and the other one is...
the first one we saw.
Is Portland's Place?
That's Portland Place, John Adams.
Yes.
Yeah. John Adams.
And the third one is the Alvar Aalto Villa in Finland. This was really kind of a finding for me, because actually I started to work with film, and I haven't worked with film before. So I made one other video before, actually on a flag tower in also a very specific architectural location. I don't have an image, but about this brutalist flag towers. I'm sure people know them from the Nazi time. Yes. So I made a film on the top there, and basically there was a fire-spitting performer, a punk performer, and it was more like edited like with music, and behind there is this famous piece by Lawrence Wiener, a text piece. So, but a kind of occupying space. In this case, it was even more like a bit, how do you say, a bit more punky. I don't know how to say, like a bit more revolutionary. No, a bit more like trying to occupy something which actually has a very strong connotation with the Nazis, and trying to, use this building or even be more powerful in it, kind of trying to overcome that kind of inscription. And if you look at politics, especially in Austria, I think it's still important.
So do you work between London and Vienna?
No, this was a piece which I just did before.
But I mean today?
Today I'm
Maybe it's a good time to start, to get to know the artist, yes.
No, I moved to London in 2004 to do an MA in Goldsmiths, and most of the time since then I'm based in London. I was in New York for residency, I was in Trinidad and Tobago for residency, and I am also very close to the Austrian art scene, because
do you think your work is kind of within that context, or?
No, actually not. I don't think so. I think everything I experimented in terms of film really comes from that experience living abroad. it was very important to go, and especially in London, there's an amazing scene of film artists. There's a lot of very, very good film artists, and my work has been supported by Film London and by, certain funding bodies which really tried to foster film art. Mm-hmm. So it was a very good place to be here.
So you would say that because before you, a previous dialogue we had Yinka Shonibare here, who was born in London but went to Nigeria and then came back to study. So there was a very strong sense of identity that he's now sort of going back to Nigeria, building his residency, a sort of a retirement home and residency there. Yeah. So in that sense, it might be, it's interesting to think about you as somebody who's, I guess in this particular political moment, European, in London, and sort of you almost have this kind of screen that you can draw onto, called Brexit, or, so
How do you feel about that? You're also from Europe.
But I'm not from the EU.
You're not from the EU?
So I don't care.
You don't care, in the first place. This is a shocking moment. If you talk now about Brexit, I'm happy to talk about that.
I mean, how do you think it might affect your work? Because your work is very political, and we will get to later films that I think that perhaps Eighteen Spirit is probably the most political, and it talks about the sort of current. You could almost see it as a world affairs thing in some ways.
When Brexit happened, I was in Trinidad and Tobago. Mm-hmm. I experienced in a place as a white European, there's a diverse mix of people in Trinidad and Tobago through the history, of course, through colonization. There's a lot of Indians, black, white people. It's a big mix, but still as a European, you are kind of the other, which I've never really experienced in my life. And after Brexit happened, I came back. At first it was kind of a shock to be somewhere already, experiencing, certain prejudices towards myself because I'm white. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting experience I've never had in my life. Fair enough, everybody should have that at some point. And then I came back to Europe, to England, after Brexit, and then there was this other kind of suddenly being in Britain and, with this feeling of, they want to actually not be part of Europe, and what does that mean for being European? So it was quite an interesting year of thinking a lot about that, but I think a lot of people have to deal with that in a moment because so many people come from Europe and study here. Mm-hmm.
And it was something that I think it's maybe a big question for artists. How will that show in the work? It's a big political events usually reflect in art.
I wouldn't really. I wouldn't have Brexit or something like this directly in my work, For example,
but it affects you as somebody who has just said that your self as an artist is very much constructed around your journeys around the world, and now you have a moment which almost questions the movement, right?
Yes, because I think we should have the possibility to move free. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great thing about the European Union. Mm-hmm. But the whole, I just did not just move around Europe. I moved actually the United States or the West Indies. This is such a big, complex thing to talk about that I'm not quite sure where I should start.
Okay, so maybe
I think maybe in my work, what I'm really interested in is, and it of course touches certain elements of that, is like, the kind of, if I say liquefaction of grammar, but what kind of grammar do I talk about? I'm talking about filmic grammar, but I'm also talking about grammar of who we think we are as humans, as bodies. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of course, race or ideologies or religions, that's such a big construction about who we think we are. And of course, if you take that into...
Well, the question identity.
Yes, if you talk about, if you bring that in terms of, you know, European Union, of course, we can. It has an impact.
Yeah.
It is a construction.
And okay, and so just before we move on back onto film.
Yeah.
You did mention that you weren't a film artist from start.
No.
So you were a painter. And how did film emerge from painting, or?
I've just studied painting in my first MA I did in Vienna. That's quite a long time ago, and I stopped painting because I spent a year in New York, and I was like interested in moving image, and I bought a video camera, but also because I thought the medium of painting has a very specific way of working. You're in your studio, you're quite secluded, you know, and I was interested in collaboration. Film is a medium which you cannot do by yourself. You collaborate with a lot of people. I was very interested in that. And also, as I mentioned before, this piece I actually made in Vienna on that flag tower was actually when Haider came to power. It was a very performative, colorful piece, but there was a quite political, strong impact, you know. And I felt like I want to go out of my studio and work with people, and you know, and we didn't really had a big history of demonstration culture, of a culture of people going on the street and, you know, saying, I don't want that. I mean, that changed so much. That was in 2000. I mean, now it's a totally different time. So I was interested in working differently, and that's one reason why I also changed from painting. But I could imagine that at some point I go back to painting.
That's interesting. And so maybe Gonda, if we get to Gonda. So this is still interiors.
Maybe Gonda.
This is Alto. This is
this is Alba Alto Villa.
And then this is
Crystal Gaze, which is another piece which, you know, is about fictional character in Art Deco. This is Art Deco Palace in London, and Art Deco was very much used as a feature in Hollywood sets. So, and I used that set, and this was a short film I did with 3 actually real actresses, and they kind of reflect and their identity as being an image. Being an image as you are an image in a film, and how that feels or what that means. And of course architecture in this sense was related to this idea of Hollywood of the 1920s.
And Hollywood being an image.
Not a way, I think we could talk about the whole image production of our visual culture of Hollywood, which is so embedded in us. That's everywhere, you know, in advertising, in our memories, in everything we have seen. Is a lot of things come from filmmaking, you know, from that time, and a lot of people use images and maybe don't always know the underlying connotations. So I really, when I kind of, for example, make films, or especially this one, I think the way they are constructed or the way they actually play out against themselves, you know, I'm talking about that kind of embedded ideologies in the images. So that's how I produce images in the first place.
Because they have a meaning rather than
yes, and I mean,
just communicating.
If you want to talk about Hollywood or critique Hollywood, of course, it's the strongest image production who has ideologies embedded, and people don't realize it. You know, they watch it and take it with them, but don't always aware what it means.
And then, I mean, Gonda in 2012. What I wanted to ask to start with, I mean, you'll tell us about Gonda, but and it maybe links back to what you previously said about coming out of being a painter into the world of film, and that becoming a very much more collaborative environment. So Gonda was done in a very collaborative way in terms of the script. So can you tell us about it?
Gonda was actually made in 2012, and I came across a writer called Ayn Rand. She is a Russian writer, emigrated to America, and she embraced the kind of free spirit to capitalism, and she wrote about it, and she would be, she would have said something like, there is nothing like society, which Margaret Thatcher would have said, or she was like a bedrock of something like Greenspan would believe in. So she had, her kind of philosophy was very much spread out for that ideas, and I was interested in her because she became very popular again after the first financial crisis, after 2007. So her books became republished, and I looked at the work, and there was one book I've been quite interested, which was called Ideals, because it was never actually, it was a theater play, but it was never actually produced. And it is about an actress which is just needs, to keep it short, the story, she basically needs to, for herself, to keep on going as an actress, to keep on being satisfied. One of her fans needs to sacrifice himself. That is comes through that story. So one of her fans kills himself for her, and I was just interested, and in the way that Ayn Rand's, her own voice is basically the voice of this actress. So she basically portrays herself in that book, and so I was interested, what can you do with this authoritarian voice? What could I do with this book? What could I do with all these ideologies embedded in this work at that political moment of time? So I asked a lot of collaborators, like curators, people from theory, artists, to come together, and we had like 2 days of workshop and looked at this book. There were like all these fan letters involved in this book, and everybody came with their own fan letters, and so we accumulated certain texts. And there was also Maria Fusco involved, which is a very amazing writer. And we transcribed this whole 2 days, and Maria then used that as a starting point and then wrote the script for a single voice, and that was the script. So with this script I decided to work again with this idea of strong ideology. So I casted 5 models. And this is the first time when I collaborated with Valentine de Hing, because I came across her because I was thinking about, should I maybe cast a man instead of a woman? I mean, a man in a female role. But then I came across her, I asked her, and she was the best person to ask. And the other 4 participants are also models. And the film is set is set as a theater play. So this single voice I got as a script, I divided into 5 voices of these characters, and then there's another set which is you have it just now here. It's the volcano in Sicily, which. So there's certain, it's intercut, and you can always see Valentine on this very, very specific landscapes. And it's also set as a counterpoint. First of all, there's this theater space where they're all really glamorous and talking in this quite specific way, which is between philosophy, fiction, and then it's intercut between this vast landscape. So there's also this Brechtian breaking of storytelling, and and conveying one voice, but like spreading out actually a lot of voices, and the way the text is used on top of the image also creates a quite kaleidoscopic feeling. So this idea of identity and construction really is played out in this case as the way it's edited, the way it's text and image comes together in a multiply. It's basically one voice kind of goes into a lot of voices.
And now the editing process is quite obviously an important part of your technique, and it is, as we've previously said, there is a lot of cross-references, so it's almost like reading a book and then going to notes and then turning back and sort of finding your way around, but in a kind of narrative, in a kind of fixed narrative, which is a film. I mean, so, it's something that repeats also.
Yeah, so that's also something which is, in this body of, especially in this body of work, I kind of try to develop my own way of editing or putting things together. So in a way, I believe that images have an agent, and images also come to you, and it's not just that you, it's not just that the spectator looks at an image and you interpret the image. So I'm really interested in this in-betweenness and how images can also travel and how far you let yourself into that kind of visual language. So I don't want to give an audience, in this case, a paved way which you can walk and understand. It's actually a work where you understand through watching or understanding. I don't even know if we can say understanding. It's it's actually what I try to explore with this idea of identity and ideology. You know, how do you actually, how strict are we with these ideas? You know, this is a permanent deconstruction and construction, and it's how you as a viewer let yourself into that language.
And it's very individual, because every viewer will absolutely see it in a different way. Will have a different kind of understanding, I guess.
It has also, as a visual piece, it's very seductive. So it is a play also with a quite specific seductiveness. So you will be thrown. You will be pulled in, but then you also be pulled out. You know, it's going back and forth a bit. Yeah.
And these are some final scenes from Gonda.
I mean, I can show a trailer of it.
Yeah. Yes.
I have just a 1 minute trailer. I can show you. I might need your help again. Sorry. I mean, it's a 20-minute film. It will actually be on display at the Royal College of Art. The curatorial program is taking this piece as a starting point. Basically, they're using my methodology and inviting other people to act on it. So it will be on display soon for a week. Okay. So if for some, then you could watch it as a whole, because it's a 20-minute piece. It's too long to show.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we've clearly here tried to do something quite unusual, and that is to talk about film before
watching them.
Before watching it, which is a sort of almost like an artistic attempt.
We could also have shown one film and talked about it.
Just that film?
No, any.
Oh, any.
Some works.
Ethereal, sidereal, funereal, arterial, venereal, immaterial, ethereal, sidereal, funereal.
A human is defined by potential, not by obedience to template. In that way, her handwriting was future-producing. A human cannot alone carry the burden of revolution. It would excise their subjectivity and place it in the surface of fears and anxieties they had not themselves created. There is something about me I can't give a name to. Something I had and lost. Yet feel as if I'm keeping for myself. For all of us.
Yeah, so well, the Medea.
This is just an installation piece, image. Maybe you go further. So this is the next piece.
And so now Medea is probably in some, I mean, to me at least, somebody who's an architect, even more about identity. And it's really purely almost looking at identity and the kind of either clashes or findings. And then it's put in a space. And then so space becomes...
The caves.
The caves, yeah.
The wand.
Yeah, the wand. So the kind of interior and exterior.
Yeah. But I have to go back to Pasolini, or maybe I haven't mentioned him, but in this case Pasolini was very interesting to me. Pasolini made a film which is called Medea, and he worked with Maria Callas. So he worked with someone who is not an actress, and Pasolini was one of the first people who was talked about globalization in the 70s when nobody really was talking about it. He was actually using this ancient myth because, it's like Eurydice, Medea, and talking about kind of translating it into a costume drama, into a portrait film in the sense that he worked with Maria Callas, who never sings in the film, to a ritual theater, to an almost documentary film, and also to a political play, in a sense that he used the content of that film as because the main story of Medea is when you steal that golden fleece, then you have the power and you can do anything. You have basically world power. So it talks about abuse of power, So, and it's a Marxist interpretation of Pasolini, his film. So, and I was interested in his methodology. So I actually asked J.D. Sampson to portray Medea, who is also a singer, but who is a queer identity, who also doesn't sing in my film, who stands in with her person, with her subjectivity, her idea of identity as a canvas in this film. And she plays, in this sense, Medea and Jason. And I'm also not so interested in general in this kind of idea of killing of the children. I'm more interested, this kind of big happening in Medea, but what does this actually mean? If you translate it, it means actually how do we treat the world that our offspring cannot use it anymore. So it's really thought through more like from environmentalist point of view, and that's also the way Pasolini was thinking that film through. And I again worked with a person who comes from theory, Patricia McCormack. She's a philosophy professor in Cambridge. And she wrote a book which is called Cinesexual, which I actually used this title. And what she basically means with cinesexual is that that kind of queerness doesn't really mean a sexual orientation, but it means just an openness to approach, to just not see things in a binary system, but to a kind of in a kind of multiplicity. So that kind of ideas which she uses in cinema, and she calls it cinesexual, and what she wants to break that, that kind of ideas. That's something which I was very interested in. I also used her title, and she wrote that script for that film.
For this film.
Yeah.
And again, there is a setting of a.
This is in Cappadocia in Turkey, where also Pasolini filmed. So I really used quite a lot of things what Pasolini did. I hope he will forgive me. I mean, he's dead. He got murdered, as maybe everybody knows.
He was murdered?
Yeah, he was murdered. He was a gay man. And I guess it was not very safe as a gay man in Italy at that point. I mean, also he made that really provocative film, Sadum. What is the film called? Sorry, I forgot now the film, the title of the film, but it's a very provocative film, and actually it's also interesting. It was inspired by the Nazis. It's actually very outlandish, but it plays a lot with dirt and disgust, but it's really a reflection from him towards the nationals.
And one more thing is that in your films you really use you cast people by their character in a way, because then their character becomes sort of critical to the story rather than having a story to perform. That's something I think is very interesting. So
it's like a way I use architecture.
Yeah, all right.
You know, the way I was interested in architecture is what architectural Hetty has inscribed in itself. The way I'm working with performers, they lend me their identities, and that is already projected as their characters in the film. And so they play partly themselves.
And in some ways, so you're almost like a documentary filmmaker.
You can call me what you like.
Okay. It's quite good that you don't have a very specific...
No, I make my first feature film and then we can talk when it's finished.
As a film. So this is more of how your work is shown?
Yeah, this is an installation in the Hayward Gallery because it's maybe interesting from an architectural point of I don't know what architects think. But I'm using also, or I made also this sculptures, which you can just see here a bit. So this idea of liquidity is also in a sculpture. So also this idea of how narratives spread out from a screen. So the narratives, which are already kind of broken narratives, extend into a space, you know, and with other screens which are transparent fabrics. So the way it's constructed, the space with the narratives are always overlapping. Yeah, this is something which is maybe where I have really also worked with an existing architecture. It's in the modernist building in the Anna Zwanziger House in Vienna. And the color I'm using here is this brown. And the building out, it's basically a glass cube. You can see.
It's the one that was transported to Vienna from.
Yeah, it was
the Netherlands.
It was a world expo. Yeah. Pavilion, yes.
I mean, it's amazing the size of it, and it was transported from the Netherlands, or.
You know better than me. I didn't know that. Are you sure?
I think so. That's in Vienna. Yes, it was from somewhere.
Yeah, it's
definitely transported.
It has been used in the
world.
World
Expo somewhere else, and it was brought back to Vienna. Yeah.
So, for example, I used all the color reference of the architecture, and also the kind of shapes and grids, but also I worked with an architect. I worked with Bunchu, maybe anybody knows him, he's based in Berlin. He's a great... he's a great architect. He has his own architectural office. And we together actually worked on these vitrines, you know. He actually planned them. It's not just me. So there's also sculptures which relate to this idea of liquidity, and I worked a lot with organs. These are tongues. And this is the one, for example, this yellow thing, it's a heart. So this idea of body and
so I guess this is where your work starts, you know, you sort of start going back to more physical objects. I mean, such as painting in a way.
The title, But We Loved Her, came from, I went to a demonstration, no, I went to the funeral of Margaret Thatcher.
Wow.
Almost a demonstration.
Almost. I went to the funeral of the big punk icon, what's his name?
There was a demonstration alongside.
What was the name of the punk? the punk person, the ex-husband of Vivienne Westwood.
Oh,
Who?
Where they set the boat on fire?
He's like the who he invented punk. Basically, he produced all the punk.
Yes.
No, sorry. It will.
Somebody should know.
It will come back to me.
Yeah.
I went to his funeral.
That's
as
why
well.
she started designing punk clothes. Yeah.
Yeah, they actually had to get a shop at the beginning, which was called
it was
Sex.
his shop.
It was his shop.
Yeah.
And it was called Sex.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but this title, "But We Loved Her." So when I went to the funeral of Margaret Thatcher, there was one person who had like a banner, and it said, "But we loved her." And I really liked that banner, and this body of work, which I was talking now about, Pasolini, like Medea, Gonda, Plastinus actually is also in this work, and a lot of sculptures. So this kind of body of work, which related a lot to a time when I was here in London, this kind of ambiguity, how we actually deal with this criticism. When you take criticism is also very difficult, because I think we are kind of part of a system. It's not so easy to just have a critical standpoint, and also, we are all kind of explorers and exploiters, and we are all in every.
It's a duality of an artist,
yes.
Right?
And so I think this ambiguity is very much in this sentence, and that's the reason why I called the show like this.
So maybe because we've been...
That's the outside of the building. I just put it in because it's architecture. So that's maybe interesting.
We appreciate it very much. Let's maybe run to Atom Spirit, so we can let people ask some questions. I mean, your
this
work
is performance.
This is performance alongside.
Gonda's performed. So this is my last film, yeah?
So Atom Spirit is the latest, and that very much tackles a kind of global idea of ecology and where we are, in terms of whether we're already in a post-apocalyptic world. Or
I think we are.
We are.
No?
Maybe.
I mean, look at what... I've seen amazing... plans of architects who use actually structure of nature to build buildings. I mean, I think the way we're thinking now is very different, and also in any discipline, whatever you do. Yeah. So this work was produced.
And this was when you were in Trinidad, when you heard about Brexit,
Yeah, but I had already before the plan to make this film. I didn't make this film because of Brexit.
No, we know that.
We all were shocked. That was like a surprise for all of us. But the plan was, or the idea was, again, working with Valentine, and I wanted to create a group of people which I could cast there together. So I was working with the LGBT community in Trinidad, and I casted like 4 people and Valentine, and they are scientists in these films, and they're kind of looking for... It's not really even said what they're looking for, but it's it's kind of an exploration in the world of or the idea of extinction, because first of all we are going through the 6th mass extinction as we all get told every day in the news about that. And then also I was interested in the idea of extinction in terms of extinction already happened for a lot of people, for example, also in the West Indies, extinction happened for a lot of indigenous people. So this was an idea. Then there was also this idea, of course, if you talk about science fiction or where we are now, there's technology which is almost more coming into our lives, but also is part of that fiction in terms of how we evolve as humans. And so I had 4 sets in this film. So I had the rainforest, I had a club, and I had natural sets like the beach, and then I had like a field station where there's like research, and then another kind of lab which there is where you can make very specific scans. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think maybe you can ask me some questions about this film, because I don't know where I'm just talking. Getting somewhere, I'm not quite sure where I'm getting.
Well, should we?
Should you
well,
watch
I think it was
a trailer about
Yeah,
that?
we can watch a trailer. Yes.
Yes, and then maybe we can open it to questions.
We can open it to questions.
Yes. Why my hard drive disappeared? I need to find it again. Oh, come on. My hard drive disappeared. Okay. Okay. Fine. And the film screen. It actually carries the title of my feature film, because it's also a trailer for my feature film. But it is actually from Atom Spirit. Short trailer. So the text I'm using in the film is used in spoken word, because spoken word is very popular in the West Indies. So a lot of young people go on stage and talk about their problems or like things which happened. It's a political act. So I use spoken word, but with text I produce together with a friend, and the music is also produced in Trinidad with local artists and musicians. And
this sort of led you to the first feature film that you're doing.
I can briefly say what the feature film is about. Yes. So basically, a lot of we have seen here a dance scene, which you have seen a woman in a red dress, and she actually got killed after I shot that film approximately 2 months ago, and it was hate crime. So basically, homosexuality is illegal, and unfortunately, this person which I worked with got killed. It was really tragic, and so there is a lot of people who are queer wanna leave the Caribbean because it's unsafe. So there's a lot of people wanna go to the Netherlands. So I met another trans woman there who just moved to the Netherlands because you can stay there as a political asylum, and she also can get like transgender health care. And Valentine lives in the she lives in the Netherlands, and she comes from that liberal background. You know, she was already as a child in therapy. A documentary film was made of her as a child, as a transgender child. She was always in the public, and it is a very liberal country. So what is going to happen? I introduced my friend from Trinidad and Valentine, and they develop a friendship. And for example, Heaven, this queer woman from the Trinidad, she's now at the moment taking hormones from the black market. So I kind of fictionalize actually that story, and they become friends. And then it will evolve in a science fiction again, which is filmed back in the Caribbean. But it's in the format of a feature film.
So we're all looking forward to that. Any questions? Yes, Fergus.
I wanted to ask about if you were aware of the Maggie Nelson book, The Argonauts, which was released like last year or something.
Can you say it again?
Maggie Nelson book, released I think it was last year.
Yeah.
Titled The Argonauts, and it's about gender fluidity and kind of queer identity. And it just struck me as I didn't know if it was coincidental, but she's also kind of appropriated this title from the story of Jason and the Argonauts as well.
Oh, really? No, I don't know it.
Kind of,
I need to look it into. I write it down. Thank you.
Well, that was the first question, but also the second one was, it's really interesting to hear about sort of identity and film, and also film and space, which is quite often spoken about together, but I wondered if you have a particular kind of way of working with time, because it strikes me that time is quite important in a lot of your work.
Yeah, time is, of course, a big thing, because to construct a space with images is always about time as well. And especially in the first works you've seen, for example, interiors, the way it's edited, you know, we didn't really talk about that, but the way it's edited, the space, it becomes another space in time, you know. So film is a sculpture in time as well. So
kind of impossible space, but only possible in the film.
Yes, so it's always part of it, and it's edited as a loop. A lot of works of mine are edited in a loop, and you don't need to see the beginning or the ending. So you come in a gallery installation, it's in a loop. So you have an illusion sometimes that you haven't watched it, or you have maybe watched it, but the story evolves differently. So time is of course important. And I made another film which was called Lunch in Fur, which I also had like 3 women from the surrealist movement. Dora Maar, Merit Oppenheim, and Josephine Baker meeting as old ladies and talking actually about memory and time. And then you can see the film and how the film then also already becomes quite, of course, quite clear that it's also a space where time is stored, you know, because you just watch a film when you project it. So it's also, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of ways of thinking about time in film.
Absolutely. I mean, the interiors film, I think, was particularly rich from that perspective, because you kind of took a house, presumably now or whenever it was shot, which kind of had its own history, and you were drawing on that. The missing Barbara Hepworth sculpture. But then also the film itself had a look, and the actresses were kind of also set back in time. So you were kind of like travelling backwards there. But then the way I didn't catch the title because I just missed the beginning, but the film which is Torn in the middle, this is much more of a kind of straightforward relationship with time. It's much more like what people would call real time. And I wondered how you feel actually about when your film is played on a loop like that, because often when you put a lot of effort into the construction of that space or that sequence of time in a film, it's very easy to get precious about how it's viewed, when it starts, when it finishes, kind of thing, and how long people watch it for. But when you see it in a room which is constantly on loop, I know myself in the past, it's been a difficult thing to kind of handle. That somebody might come in the middle and leave before the end. Come at the end and leave at the beginning.
You know, if you show work in a gallery space, you're not under control. And also, that's the reason the way I edit it, that there is no beginning and an end in that sense, you know. And as you say, it's an illusion of time. Yes, it's an illusion of time, and there is no end and beginning, and there is no history, and where is it placed, and it's filmed now, but then I film on 60mm, and it looks like archival material, so I play with all these ideas. But if I would make, and because I haven't made a narrative which is like linear and which tells a story, then I would really like that film, people actually coming at the beginning and watching it to the end. But the work I've done so far doesn't work like this. But, you know, I would display different works in different ways. I do like loops. I do like, because also when I create this environment, you don't need to know everything. You know, I think if someone wants to stay, fine. 3 minutes is most of the time people stay and actually watch it twice. And for example, with the films which have more difficult texts, it kind of, you get something and you maybe want to dwell on something and you take something out with you and which is important to you, and I can't control that in terms of a gallery setting.
Any more questions? Any more thoughts? Well, you're more than welcome to come and talk to Ursula after we stop officially. She'll stick around for a bit. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ursula, very much. Thank you.